Imagine walking into a world you've dreamed of your whole life, only to be told you don't belong. That's exactly what happened to Xavier Calloway, a young boy with big dreams of becoming a pilot. But when a seasoned captain dismisses him with nothing more than a smirk and a few cutting words, Xavier is faced with a choice: walk away or prove that the sky has no limits. This is a story of resilience, justice, and a reckoning no one saw coming. Stay with us. You won't want to miss how this ends. Before we dive in, let us know, what time are you listening to this and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. The airport buzzed with life. People moved with purpose, dragging suitcases, checking schedules, rushing toward their gates. Some carried excitement, others exhaustion. But for Xavier Calloway, this place wasn't just a stop along the way. It was his future. He stood near one of the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, staring out at the endless row of aircraft. His breath fogged up the glass slightly, but he didn't move away. Instead, he traced the outline of a jet with his fingertip, as if trying to memorize every detail. His mother, Camille, stood a few steps behind, scrolling through her phone. She had agreed to bring him along for a behind-the-scenes visit, while she handled a few business meetings at the corporate offices nearby. Most kids might have been thrilled at the idea of skipping school for a day, but Xavier wasn't thinking about that. His mind was on the planes. A pilot walked by, rolling a sleek black suitcase behind him, his uniform crisp, gold stripes shining on his shoulders. Xavier's eyes followed him, admiration clear in his expression. He didn't just want to fly one day, he needed to. "Excuse me, sir?" Xavier turned, his voice careful but filled with curiosity. The pilot, a tall man with a neatly combed side part, paused and looked down at him. "Yeah, kid. How do you become a pilot?" The man glanced at him briefly before offering a tight-lipped smile. "Takes a lot of training, a lot of hours. You need to be disciplined. It's not for everyone." Xavier nodded, taking in every word. But before he could ask anything else, the pilot turned and continued walking toward the employee entrance. Not for everyone. The words sat uncomfortably in Xavier's mind. He wasn't sure why, but there was something in the way the man had said it. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe he was overthinking it. Still, as he turned back toward the window, watching another plane taxi onto the runway, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just been dismissed before he had even started. Xavier couldn't stop thinking about what the pilot had said. Not for everyone. The words echoed in his mind as he wandered through the airport with his mother, moving toward a quieter section where airline employees passed in and out of restricted areas. His mother was deep in conversation on her phone, barely noticing as he slowed his pace, drawn toward a hallway leading to the pilot's lounge. The sign next to the door read, "Crew members only." Xavier hesitated, glancing around. He knew he wasn't supposed to be here, but curiosity tugged at him. Just a quick look. He stepped closer, peering inside. The room was filled with pilots and flight attendants, some sitting with coffee, others reviewing flight plans on tablets. He spotted the pilot from earlier, talking to another man who looked older, with graying hair and a slightly smug expression. That's when he heard the voice. "Kid, what are you doing here?" Xavier turned and found himself face to face with Bradley Hewitt. The pilot's uniform was neatly pressed. His sleeves rolled just slightly to reveal a silver watch on his wrist. His sharp blue eyes studied Xavier with the same sort of look people gave to lost luggage, an inconvenience. "I just wanted to see," Xavier started, but Bradley cut him off. "This is a restricted area," Bradley said, his voice flat. "You don't belong here." Xavier blinked, caught off guard. "I just wanted to ask some questions about flying." Bradley exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "Listen, kid, there's a time and place for everything, all right? But you don't just wander into places you're not supposed to be." Xavier could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. There was something in Bradley's tone, something unspoken but heavy. "I want to be a pilot," Xavier said, standing a little straighter. Bradley raised an eyebrow, then let out a short chuckle. "A pilot, huh?" Xavier nodded. "Yes, sir." Bradley crossed his arms, tilting his head slightly. "It's not that simple. You need training, years of experience. And let's be honest, it's not exactly a career where just anyone makes it." Xavier frowned. What do you mean? Bradley smirked, but there was no warmth in it. Some people just aren't cut out for this. That's just how it is. Xavier felt his stomach tighten. Before he could say anything, another voice cut in. Is there a problem here? Xavier turned and saw Jordan Reyes, a younger pilot with a confident stance. He had seen him earlier in the terminal, chatting with flight attendants. Unlike Bradley, his expression wasn't dismissive. It was curious. Bradley stepped back slightly, shaking his head. No problem. Just explaining some things. Jordan's eyes flicked between the two before settling on Xavier. You interested in flying? Xavier nodded. Jordan smiled. Then don't let anyone tell you it's not for you. Bradley exhaled sharply, shaking his head before muttering, You're filling the kid's head with ideas. Jordan didn't look at him. Instead, he focused on Xavier. You should keep asking questions. Just maybe ask the right people. Xavier felt something shift inside him. Bradley didn't say another word as he turned and walked away. But Xavier had heard enough. Xavier followed Jordan out of the crew lounge, his mind racing. The interaction with Bradley had left a bitter taste, but Jordan's words lingered. Don't let anyone tell you it's not for you. They walked toward a quieter part of the terminal, past rows of windows where planes taxied in and out. Jordan slowed his pace and glanced down at Xavier. That guy back there, Jordan said, nodding in the direction of the lounge. Don't let him get to you. Xavier hesitated. Does he treat everyone like that? Jordan smirked, but there was something tired in his eyes. Number, just the people he doesn't think belong here. Xavier frowned. What does that mean? Jordan sighed, folding his arms as they stopped near a row of seats. When I first started flying, people like Bradley looked at me the same way, like I was in the wrong place. Xavier studied him. But you're a pilot. Jordan nodded. Yeah, and so were the guys who told me I wouldn't make it. Xavier clenched his jaw. He didn't like the way that sounded. Like no matter how hard he worked, there would always be people trying to push him out before he even got started. Why? Xavier asked. Jordan tilted his head. Why what? Why do they care? Jordan let out a small chuckle, but it wasn't out of humor. Because some people don't like change. They think there's only one kind of person who should fly these planes. Xavier didn't need Jordan to spell it out for him. The words not for everyone took on a whole new meaning. Jordan sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Look, I don't know what you're planning, but if flying is really what you want to do, don't let guys like Bradley scare you off. They don't decide who belongs. Xavier nodded, his grip tightening around the strap of his backpack. Something in his chest settled, something solid. Bradley might have tried to push him away, but he wasn't leaving. Not now, not ever. Xavier couldn't stop thinking about what Jordan had said. The idea that people like Bradley existed in every profession, standing guard at doors they didn't own, deciding who was worthy of stepping through. That didn't sit right with him. The next day, he convinced his mother to let him return to the airport while she attended another meeting. This time, he didn't just watch the planes. He wanted to learn, really learn. He found himself near a group of flight crew prepping for a flight. He stood close enough to listen, absorbing every bit of conversation. That's when he saw Bradley again. The older pilot was standing with a few other crew members, gesturing as he spoke. Xavier hesitated, but his feet moved before he could second-guess himself. He walked up, waiting for a pause in the conversation before speaking. Excuse me, Captain Hewitt? Bradley turned, his brow lifting. You again? Xavier nodded. I wanted to ask about the flight systems you were talking about. One of the other pilots chuckled. Kid's got nerve. Bradley studied Xavier for a long moment before exhaling. You really don't give up, do you? Xavier straightened his shoulders. No, sir. Bradley smirked, shaking his head. Fine. You want to know how these planes work? Xavier nodded quickly. Bradley folded his arms. Then go home, kid. Read a book. Watch some videos. Come back when you know something. Xavier's face burned, but he didn't back down. I do know things. Bradley chuckled. Oh, yeah? Like what? Xavier hesitated. Just for a second. And that was all Bradley needed. See? The pilot smirked. This isn't some hobby, kid. This is real life. You don't just show up and ask to be here. You earn it. Xavier clenched his fists, Before he could say anything, Jordan's voice cut in. Funny, Jordan said, stepping forward. I don't remember earning the right to be belittled when I was a cadet. The group fell silent. Bradley's smirk faded slightly. This is different. Jordan raised an eyebrow. Is it? Xavier looked between them, realization dawning. This wasn't just about him. This was bigger than one conversation, bigger than one interaction. Bradley wasn't just gatekeeping him. He had been doing this for years. Xavier exhaled slowly. He didn't need to win this argument. All he had to do was keep showing up. And one day he'd prove that Bradley was wrong. Not just about him, but about everyone he had ever tried to push away. Xavier sat in the terminal the next morning, watching planes take off one after another. The engines roared, their power vibrating through the windows. He imagined himself in the cockpit, hands steady on the controls, guiding one of those jets into the sky. That dream felt closer than ever, but it also felt heavier, because now he understood what he was up against. He spotted Jordan Reyes walking toward the crew entrance, coffee in hand. Xavier stood, moving quickly to catch up. Jordan! Jordan glanced back and grinned. Didn't think I'd see you here again so soon. Xavier fell into step beside him. I want to know more about what it takes to be a pilot, not just flying, but everything. Jordan raised an eyebrow. You serious? Xavier nodded. Jordan chuckled. All right, kid. You want to learn? Let's see what you got. He led Xavier toward the maintenance hangar, where a handful of mechanics worked on an aircraft. Jordan nodded toward one of the engineers. This is where it all starts, he said. Before you ever step into a cockpit, you have to understand the machine you're flying. Xavier's eyes widened as he took it all in. The panels, the exposed wires, the intricate systems that made flight possible. Jordan leaned against the fuselage. You still interested? Xavier grinned. More than ever. A voice cut through the moment. Still wasting time, Reyes? Xavier turned and saw Bradley Hewitt standing nearby, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Jordan didn't move. Didn't realize educating the next generation was a waste of time. Bradley smirked. Sure, if you actually think this is the next generation. The air in the hangar seemed to tighten. Xavier's fists clenched at his sides. Jordan exhaled sharply. You know what, Hewitt? I've let you talk your talk for years. But let's be real. You're scared, Bradley scoffed. Of what? Jordan stepped closer. Of change. Of the fact that the world doesn't belong to people like you anymore. Bradley's smirk faltered, just for a second. Xavier saw it, and so did everyone else. Bradley recovered quickly, shaking his head. You don't know what you're talking about, Reyes. Jordan tilted his head. Don't I? The mechanics had stopped working. Pilots passing through the hangar slowed their steps, sensing something happening. Xavier didn't move. He wanted to hear what happened next. Bradley exhaled sharply. I earned my place in this industry. I worked for it. Jordan nodded. Yeah, so did I. Bradley narrowed his eyes. You want to pretend this industry is a free-for-all now? That just anyone can waltz in and take a seat in the cockpit? Jordan's jaw tightened. I want an industry where the best pilots get hired, no matter what they look like. Xavier felt his chest tighten. Bradley scoffed, shaking his head. You sound just like the corporate suits upstairs. A voice rang out from behind them. Funny, I am one of those suits. Xavier turned. So did everyone else. Standing at the entrance to the hangar, hands in his pockets, was Franklin Calloway. Bradley's face drained of color. Silence stretched, thick and heavy. Franklin stepped forward, his presence alone commanding the room. I've been watching, he said simply. Bradley swallowed. Sir, Franklin raised a hand, silencing him. Let's take a walk. Bradley hesitated, then nodded stiffly. Franklin turned, and without another word, Bradley followed. Xavier let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Jordan patted his shoulder. You just witnessed the beginning of the end, kid. Xavier didn't need to ask what he meant. He already knew. Bradley followed Franklin through the quiet hallway, leading away from the hangar. His footsteps echoed slightly, his pulse steady but heavy. He had spent years in this industry, working his way up, proving himself, and now he felt something slipping. Franklin walked with an air of calm authority, hands still tucked in his pockets, his expression unreadable. When they reached an empty conference room, he finally turned. Close the door. Bradley hesitated for a fraction of a second before obeying. Franklin leaned against the edge of the table, studying him. Do you know why we're having this conversation? Bradley folded his arms, forcing himself to keep his posture straight. I assume it's about the kid. Franklin raised an eyebrow. The kid has a name. Xavier Calloway. Something shifted in Bradley's expression. He recognized the last name. Franklin let the silence settle before continuing. I've built this airline to represent the best, the most qualified, the most capable, not just the most convenient. Bradley scoffed lightly. I've never questioned qualifications, sir. Franklin tilted his head. Haven't you? Bradley exhaled sharply, his frustration seeping through. With all due respect, Mr. Calloway, I've spent 2 decades in this field. I know what it takes to succeed here. Franklin nodded. I'm sure you do. But tell me something. How many people have you decided don't belong before they even had a chance? Bradley stiffened. Franklin didn't let him answer. You see, I don't believe in gatekeepers. I believe in open doors. And you? He exhaled. You've spent your career standing in the doorway, deciding who gets to step in. Bradley's jaw tightened. I was just protecting standards. Franklin's eyes didn't waver. You were protecting your version of them. The words landed hard. Bradley had faced tough conversations before, but this was different, because deep down, he knew Franklin was right. But admitting that? Impossible. So he did what he always did. He doubled down. Sir, I don't believe I've done anything wrong, Bradley said carefully. Franklin nodded slowly. That's the problem, Captain Hewitt. A long pause stretched between them. Then Franklin pushed off the table. You're on administrative leave, effective immediately. An internal review is being conducted. Bradley's stomach dropped. You can't be serious. Franklin's gaze remained steady. You'll hear from HR by the end of the day. Bradley opened his mouth, then closed it. He knew there was no point arguing. Without another word, Franklin walked past him, leaving Bradley alone in the room. For the first time in his career, Bradley Hewitt felt powerless. Xavier sat outside one of the smaller terminals, watching the sky shift from blue to the warm hues of late afternoon. He replayed everything that had happened in his head. The way Bradley had dismissed him, the way Jordan had stood up for him, and finally the way his father had stepped in. For the first time, he truly understood who his father was, not just the CEO of an airline, but a man who had built something bigger than himself. A shadow crossed over him. You look deep in thought, Jordan said, dropping into the seat beside him. Xavier exhaled. Just thinking about everything, Jordan smirked. That's dangerous for a kid your age. Xavier laughed lightly, but his expression quickly turned serious. Bradley got put on leave. Jordan nodded. Figured that was coming. Xavier hesitated. Is that enough? Jordan studied him. What do you mean? Xavier kicked a pebble near his foot. I mean, guys like him, they don't just disappear. Even if he loses his job, there's more of them out there, right? Jordan leaned back, resting his arms on the chair. Yeah, there are. And there always will be. Xavier looked at him. So how do you deal with it? Jordan's eyes softened. You keep going. You prove them wrong. Not by arguing, not by fighting, by showing up, by being better than they ever expected. Xavier thought about that. Jordan stood, stretching. Come on, I got something to show you. Xavier followed him through a different section of the airport, down a hallway he hadn't been before. Jordan led him into a room filled with flight simulators. You want to fly? Jordan asked, grinning. Xavier's heart skipped a beat. Seriously? Jordan nodded. Let's see what you got. As Xavier stepped up to the controls, his fingers hovered over them for a moment. He wasn't just a kid standing on the outside anymore. He was stepping in. Xavier's hands hovered over the controls, his heart pounding as he stared at the flight simulator screen. The digital runway stretched before him, engines humming in his ears through the headset. He wasn't in the air yet, but for the first time, he was in control. Jordan leaned over his shoulder, arms crossed. All right, rookie, you ready? Xavier swallowed. Yeah, Jordan smirked. We'll see about that. He reached over, flipping a few switches, and the simulation adjusted. First things first, taxiing. You're not just flying, you have to get to the runway first. Xavier exhaled slowly, gripping the yoke. His fingers tightened as he eased the throttle forward. The plane moved slowly, smoothly. Jordan nodded. Not bad. Xavier felt the tiniest bit of confidence creep in. All right, Jordan said, leaning back. Now take off. Xavier's pulse jumped. He adjusted the throttle again, feeling the virtual aircraft accelerate. The numbers on the screen climbed. Keep it steady, Jordan instructed. When you hit the right speed, pull back gently. Xavier watched the indicators closely. His palms were damp, but he wasn't about to stop now. He pulled back. The nose lifted, and suddenly he was airborne. The simulator's screen filled with sky, the ground shrinking below him. Xavier barely breathed. Jordan grinned. Look at that! You're flying! Xavier let out a stunned laugh. I'm flying! Jordan clapped him on the shoulder. Not bad, kid. Not bad at all. Xavier kept his grip steady, adjusting slightly as Jordan guided him through a few simple maneuvers. Then Jordan spoke, voice softer. Feels different when you're the one in control, doesn't it? Xavier nodded, because for the first time, he wasn't just dreaming about it. He was doing it. Bradley sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The email had arrived an hour ago. Termination of employment. Bradley Hewitt. He reread the subject line, his stomach twisting. He had spent 2 decades in this industry. He had worked his way up. And now, just like that, it was over. A knock on his window startled him. He turned to see Jordan Reyes standing outside. Reluctantly, Bradley rolled down the window. Jordan studied him for a long moment. Tough day, Bradley scoffed. What do you want, Reyes? Jordan shrugged. Just checking in. Bradley let out a bitter laugh. Why? You win. The industry's yours now. Jordan shook his head. It was never about winning, Bradley. It was about making it fair. Bradley exhaled sharply, looking away. I worked for this job. I earned it. Jordan nodded. Yeah, and you lost it. Not because of politics, not because of quotas, because of you. Bradley's jaw tightened. Jordan sighed. You had a choice. You could have been better. You weren't. Bradley said nothing. Jordan stepped back, hands in his pockets. Take care of yourself, Hewitt. And then he walked away. Bradley watched him go, something heavy settling in his chest. For the first time, he wasn't angry. He was just empty. Xavier sat across from his father in the private lounge of the airport, the hum of distant conversations blending with the occasional announcement over the intercom. Franklin Calloway, always composed, stirred his coffee slowly before speaking. I heard you had your first flight simulation today. His voice was calm, steady. Xavier nodded. Yeah, it was incredible. Franklin studied him for a moment. Did it feel different than you expected? Xavier thought about it. The anticipation, the nerves, the moment his virtual aircraft lifted off the ground, the feeling of belonging. It felt real, he admitted. Franklin nodded approvingly. That's because it is real, Xavier. The only thing standing between you and that reality is time. Xavier hesitated before asking the question that had been sitting in his mind all day. Is Bradley really gone? Franklin exhaled, setting his spoon down. Yes. Xavier shifted in his seat. He'll just go somewhere else and do the same thing, won't he? Franklin leaned forward, hands clasped together. Maybe, but not here. Xavier frowned. That doesn't feel like enough. Franklin tilted his head. And what would be enough? Xavier struggled to answer. He had imagined Bradley getting some grand punishment, some kind of moment where he truly realized the damage he had done. But now that it was over, Bradley just disappeared. Franklin seemed to sense his thoughts. People like Bradley don't always get what they deserve, Xavier. But they do get what they earn. Xavier absorbed that. His father continued, and more importantly, he no longer has the power to decide who belongs here. Xavier thought back to the way Bradley had dismissed him, the way he had smirked when he assumed Xavier was nothing more than a kid with a dream too big for reality. Now, Bradley was the one on the outside. Xavier nodded slowly. I get it, Franklin smiled. Good. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft golden hue over the runway. Xavier stood at the edge of the tarmac, his hands resting in his pockets as he watched a jet prepare for takeoff. Jordan Reyes walked up beside him, sipping from a coffee cup. You look different today, Jordan noted. Xavier smirked. Yeah? Jordan nodded. More sure of yourself, Xavier shrugged. I guess I am, Jordan chuckled. Good, because we're about to see if you can actually fly for real. Xavier's eyebrows lifted. Wait, what? Jordan pointed toward a small training aircraft parked nearby. We're doing your first official flight lesson today. Xavier's stomach flipped, but excitement overpowered the nerves. He followed Jordan toward the aircraft, running his hand along the metal body before climbing into the cockpit. Jordan settled into the instructor's seat beside him. All right, rookie, let's see what you got. Xavier took a deep breath, and then he started the engine. As the plane rolled down the runway, his fingers tightened around the controls. And when he lifted off, this time for real, he didn't just see the sky, he belonged in it. The aircraft leveled out as Xavier guided it through the early morning sky. Below, the city of Atlanta stretched out in neat grids, the airport runways cutting through the landscape like veins. The sensation of flying, really flying, was unlike anything he had ever felt. Jordan sat beside him, watching closely. How does it feel? Xavier exhaled, a slow smile creeping onto his face. Like I'm where I'm supposed to be. Jordan nodded. Good answer. They flew in comfortable silence for a moment before Jordan spoke again. You know, flying isn't just about knowing the controls. It's about responsibility. You're carrying more than just yourself up here. Xavier glanced at him. What do you mean? Jordan leaned back slightly. Your dad built something big, and you're stepping into that legacy. People are going to look at you and see more than just a pilot. They're going to see what you represent. Xavier let the words sink in. I don't want to just be the boss's son, he admitted. Jordan smirked. Then don't be. Be the guy who deserves to be here. Xavier nodded, gripping the controls a little tighter, because that was exactly what he planned to do. The flight lesson ended with a smooth landing, and as Xavier climbed out of the cockpit, his father was waiting. Franklin Calloway stood with his arms crossed, watching his son carefully. How was it? Xavier wiped a hand across his forehead, grinning. Unreal. Franklin gave a small nod. And do you still think this is what you want? Xavier met his father's gaze without hesitation. More than ever. Franklin studied him for a moment, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn leather notebook. He handed it to Xavier. Xavier flipped it open. Inside were scribbled notes, flight calculations, and old log entries. What is this? My first flight log, Franklin said simply. Xavier looked up, eyes widening slightly. Franklin placed a hand on his shoulder. If you're serious about this, then you'd better start your own. Xavier swallowed the lump in his throat and nodded. He had spent his whole life looking up at the sky. Now it was time to claim it. Bradley Hewitt sat alone in a small cafe near the airport, nursing a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. His fingers tapped absently against the table, his mind replaying the last few days over and over. The official termination email, the HR exit meeting, the way his colleagues, some of whom he had worked with for years, avoided his gaze as he walked out of the building for the last time. He had told himself it wasn't fair, that it was politics, corporate nonsense, a decision made to appease the new generation. But deep down, he knew the truth. No one had come to his defense. Not one person had stood up for him, because they all knew. A shadow fell over his table. Bradley looked up to see Jordan Reyes standing there, hands in his pockets. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Jordan gestured to the empty chair. Mind if I sit? Bradley let out a sharp exhale, but gave a small shrug. Suit yourself. Jordan pulled out the chair, settling in across from him. Rough week? Bradley chuckled dryly. You could say that. Jordan stirred a packet of sugar into his coffee before speaking again. You know, I didn't come here to gloat. Bradley raised an eyebrow. Then why did you come? Jordan tilted his head. Curiosity, I guess. Bradley scoffed. Curiosity about what? Jordan's expression remained neutral. Whether you actually learned something from all this. Bradley tensed, but instead of lashing out, he just stared into his coffee. Jordan waited, patient. Finally, Bradley exhaled. I thought I was protecting something. The industry, the standards. Jordan nodded slowly. And now? Bradley's jaw clenched. Now I don't know what the hell I was doing. For the first time in a long time, he was honest. Jordan took a sip of his coffee, then stood. That's a start. Bradley didn't look up as Jordan walked away. He just sat there, feeling the weight of his own choices settle around him. The sun hung low in the sky as Xavier walked across the tarmac, his new flight log tucked under his arm. The small training aircraft sat waiting, its white exterior gleaming in the fading light. Jordan stood by the wing, arms crossed. You ready for this? Xavier nodded. Yeah, Jordan smirked. Then get in. Xavier climbed into the cockpit, strapping himself in as he scanned the controls. His hands felt steadier than the last time. Jordan slid into the instructor's seat. All right, rookie, take us up. Xavier took a deep breath, adjusted the throttle, and started down the runway. The plane rumbled beneath him, speed increasing. And then, the wheels lifted off the ground. Xavier felt his heart soar along with the aircraft. He glanced at Jordan, who simply nodded in approval. And as he looked out at the sky stretching endlessly before him, Xavier knew. This was only the beginning. At the heart of this story is a truth we all recognize. Opportunity isn't always given freely, but that doesn't mean you stop reaching for it. Xavier Calloway didn't let one man's doubt define him. Instead, he let his determination do the talking. In the end, those who build walls to keep others out often find themselves trapped behind them. Meanwhile, the ones who refuse to quit, they break barriers, not just for themselves, but for those who come after them. So tell us, have you ever faced a moment where someone doubted you, but you proved them wrong? Drop your story in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that will keep you thinking long after they end. See you in the next one.